There's an uncomfortable question most people avoid asking themselves, not because it's complicated, but because the answer feels quietly disappointing. If I earn more than I did a few years ago, why does my financial life feel exactly the same or even tighter, not worse in a dramatic way, just heavier, less flexible, like there's always a low-grade pressure sitting in the background? Bills get paid, life looks fine from the outside, but somehow the space to breathe financially never really appears. And what's unsettling is that this isn't limited to people who struggle. It's common among people who are doing well. People with degrees, stable jobs, decent salaries, people who on paper should feel ahead by now. Instead, they feel permanently caught up, never falling behind but never pulling away either. Picture a fairly normal situation in the US or Europe. Nothing extreme, someone in their late 20s or 30s. Let's say they earn the equivalent of $65,000 a year before tax in the US, or maybe 50,000 euros in a major European city. Not rich, not poor, solidly middle class. After taxes, healthcare, social contributions, and payroll deductions, that income quietly shrinks. In the US, take-home might land somewhere around $4,000 a month. In Europe, depending on the country, maybe 2,800 euros to 3,200 euros. Already the number feels different from the headline salary, but this isn't shocking. Everyone knows taxes exist, this is just how it works. Then the expenses begin to line up almost automatically. Rent or a mortgage comes first. In many cities, housing alone takes 30 to 40% of take-home pay, not because someone is reckless but because that's the market. A modest one-bedroom, a small apartment close enough to work, nothing luxurious, just functional. After that, utilities, internet, a phone plan. These aren't indulgences, they're basic infrastructure for modern life. Then transportation. Maybe it's a car payment in the US, $350, $450, sometimes more, or public transit passes in Europe, fuel costs, insurance. Add groceries, which never feel expensive in isolation but somehow always total more than expected by the end of the month. Student loan payments quietly draft themselves out. A credit card balance that never fully resets to zero. Subscriptions that feel small enough to ignore. Streaming, cloud storage, software. Gym membership that gets used just enough to justify keeping it. None of this looks irresponsible. In fact, it looks normal. That's the point. From the outside, this person is doing exactly what society suggests. They studied, they work, they pay their bills, they don't live extravagantly, they might even budget at least loosely. Yet by the time the month ends, what remains isn't meaningful space, it's leftovers, a few $100s, sometimes less. Money that technically exists but doesn't feel free. It's already mentally allocated to emergencies, irregular expenses, or the vague sense that something will come up. And something always does. This is where the frustration begins to surface, because this person isn't asking for luxury, they're asking for progress. They're asking why earning more didn't create more room, why every raise, every job change, every step forward seems to be absorbed instantly by life itself. The strange part is how quiet this absorption is. No single expense feels like the culprit. There's no dramatic mistake to point to, just a slow, steady closing of space between income and expenses. Almost as if the gap never had a chance to widen in the first place. What makes this even more confusing is the cultural messaging layered on top of it. Social feeds show peers traveling, upgrading apartments, buying newer cars, eating out regularly. No one appears stressed. No one talks about trade-offs. The visual narrative suggests that this level of consumption is simply what adulthood looks like now. So when someone feels uneasy about their finances, they assume the problem must be personal. Maybe they're just bad with money. Maybe they need better discipline. Maybe they haven't found the right system yet. Rarely do they question the structure itself. The truth is, most people aren't failing financially in obvious ways. They're failing quietly, structurally, and collectively. Not because they lack ambition or intelligence, but because they never learn to notice one specific thing: the size of the gap between what they earn and what they spend, and how aggressively modern life works to keep that gap narrow. This gap isn't just a number, it's a buffer, it's optionality. It's the difference between reacting to life and having room to decide. When the gap is small, every decision carries weight. When it's large, life feels calmer, even if income itself isn't extraordinary. But here's the uncomfortable part. The gap doesn't shrink by accident, it shrinks because of a series of reasonable decisions made in isolation. A slightly better apartment because it's closer to work, a reliable car because downtime feels risky, a few conveniences because time feels scarce. Each choice makes sense, each one improves daily life marginally, but together they form a pattern where income growth is matched almost perfectly by expense growth. The result isn't financial collapse. It's financial stagnation, a feeling of running on a treadmill that never speeds up or slows down, just continues. What's rarely acknowledged is how emotionally reinforcing this pattern is. When income rises, there's an expectation, often unspoken, that life should feel easier. So when it doesn't, people compensate by upgrading small comforts, better furniture, nicer food, more experiences. These aren't frivolous desires, they're attempts to align reality with expectation. The problem is that they solve the emotional discomfort without addressing the structural issue underneath. The gap remains tight. Sometimes it tightens further, and because the person still feels okay, there's no urgent signal to stop. Over time, this creates a strange contradiction. Someone can earn well, live responsibly, and still feel financially fragile. One unexpected expense feels disruptive. One missed paycheck feels dangerous. The margin for error is thin, not because income is low, but because expenses have quietly risen to meet it. This is the environment in which most middle-class financial stress exists today, not dramatic debt spirals, but narrow margins that leave no room for compounding, recovery, or meaningful choice. The real issue isn't spending too much, it's failing to protect the gap. And most people never even realize the gap is something that needs protecting. They assume wealth comes from earning more, not from maintaining distance between income and lifestyle. That assumption feels logical, but it's incomplete. Because if every increase in income is immediately translated into a higher cost of living, nothing fundamentally changes. The numbers grow. The stress doesn't disappear, the future remains abstract. This is the part no one explains early enough. Financial progress isn't about how impressive your income looks, it's about how much space exists between what comes in and what goes out, and how consistently that space is allowed to exist over time. Without that space, there is no leverage, no compounding, no quiet accumulation, just motion. And that's where this conversation really begins. The hidden mistake most people make isn't a reckless purchase or a lack of discipline. It's something far more subtle and socially reinforced. They treat income growth as permission to upgrade life immediately rather than as an opportunity to widen the financial gap first. This doesn't feel like a mistake while it's happening. In fact, it feels responsible, almost inevitable. When your income rises, your reference point shifts. What once felt like a stretch starts to feel normal. What once felt indulgent starts to feel deserved. And because the upgrades tend to be incremental, there's no moment where someone says, "I'm choosing to stay financially tight." They just wake up one day earning more and still feeling constrained. Let's slow this down with simple math, not to judge, but to make the mechanics visible. Imagine someone whose take-home pay is $4,000 a month. At first, their fixed expenses total $2,800. That leaves a $1,200 gap. On paper, that's meaningful. That's room for saving, investing, absorbing shocks. Now imagine this person gets a raise or switches jobs and their take-home increases to $4,600. A $600 improvement. That should matter. But instead of the gap widening to $1,800, life quietly expands. Rent goes up by $200 because they move closer to work or into a slightly nicer place. The car payment increases by $150 because they upgrade to something newer and more reliable. Dining out becomes more frequent, another $100. A few subscriptions get added or upgraded. Maybe a gym closer to home, nothing dramatic. After all of this, fixed and semi-fixed expenses rise to $3,600. The new gap, $1,000, slightly smaller than before. This is the part that's easy to miss. Income went up, but financial breathing room didn't. In fact, it shrank. Yet emotionally, the person feels like they made progress. Life is more comfortable, commutes are shorter, the car feels safer, the apartment feels calmer. These improvements are real. The problem isn't that they're wrong, it's that they consume the very resource that creates long-term stability, surplus. The gap was traded for comfort, and once traded, it's difficult to rebuild without conscious resistance. What makes this especially tricky is that modern expenses are sticky. Once you raise your standard of living, lowering it feels like failure even if it's logical. Moving to a cheaper apartment feels like regression. Driving an older car feels irresponsible. Canceling subscriptions feels petty. These decisions don't feel neutral, they feel like losses. So even if someone becomes aware that their finances are tight, revering course feels emotionally expensive. The lifestyle becomes the baseline, not the income. And that baseline demands to be maintained. Now extend this math across years instead of months. That $600 raise that could have widened the gap by $7,200 a year instead disappears into lifestyle inflation. Over 5 years, that's $36,000 of potential surplus that never materializes. Not because it was spent on something outrageous, but because it was fragmented into dozens of reasonable upgrades, each one invisible on its own, together transformative. This is where the system quietly works against people. Housing markets price based on income ranges, not individual financial goals. Car financing is designed to make higher monthly payments feel manageable, not to preserve surplus. Credit cards smooth spending so friction disappears. Subscriptions normalize ongoing outflows instead of one-time decisions. The entire structure of modern consumption is built to absorb extra income efficiently. It doesn't ask whether you want to protect the gap, it assumes you don't. Psychologically, this taps into something very human. People anchor their sense of financial success to lifestyle markers, not balance sheets. A nicer apartment feels like success. A newer car feels like security, being able to say yes to social plans feels like freedom. The gap, by contrast, is invisible. No one sees it, no one compliments it. It doesn't change how your life looks today. So when forced to choose, often unconsciously, people choose visible improvements over invisible buffers. There's also the issue of time pressure. Most people feel busy, mentally loaded, and slightly behind. When time feels scarce, convenience becomes valuable, and convenience almost always costs money. Paying more to save time feels rational when you're tired. Over time, this converts time stress into financial stress, but slowly enough that the connection isn't obvious. Life feels easier in the short term, tighter in the long term, and because the tightening happens gradually, it's rarely addressed directly. Another layer to this is comparison. Even when people claim not to care, they absorb social norms. If peers with similar incomes live a certain way, anything below that feels like underperforming. If everyone finances cars, financing feels normal. If everyone upgrades apartments after a raise, staying put feels stagnant. The fear isn't poverty, it's falling behind a perceived standard. So people protect appearance and comfort, even if it costs long-term flexibility. What's rarely discussed is that this pattern creates a ceiling. Once expenses rise close to income, future raises lose power. A $500 increase no longer changes anything meaningful. It disappears into higher prices, higher expectations, higher commitments. At that point, income growth stops feeling exciting and starts feeling necessary just to maintain equilibrium. That's when people feel trapped despite earning more than they ever thought they would. And importantly, this isn't about blaming individuals. It's about recognizing that the default path leads here. If you simply respond to income changes by adjusting lifestyle without intention, the gap will stay narrow, not because you failed, but because nothing in the system encourages you to do otherwise. No one celebrates restraint. No one rewards invisible surplus immediately. The payoff is delayed, abstract, and quiet. But the cost of ignoring this is very real. A narrow gap means emergencies feel catastrophic. Job changes feel risky. Opportunities feel inaccessible. Investing feels intimidating because there's no margin for error. The future remains something you plan around rather than shape. Over decades, this compounds into a life where income determines comfort but never freedom. The mistake then isn't spending money. It's allowing every improvement in income to be matched by an improvement in lifestyle without asking what that does to the gap. It's treating surplus as temporary rather than structural. And once this pattern is established, breaking it requires not more income, but a different way of thinking about what income is for in the first place. That shift in thinking is where financially intelligent people quietly diverge from the rest, not through extreme frugality or secret strategies, but through a deliberate relationship with the gap itself. To understand why the gap is so difficult to protect, you have to look beyond numbers and into psychology. Most financial decisions aren't made with spreadsheets. They're made with emotion, identity, and a constant negotiation between present comfort and future security. The human brain is not designed to optimize for decades from now. It's designed to reduce friction today. And modern life presents endless opportunities to do exactly that, as long as you're willing to pay for it in small, recurring amounts. One of the strongest psychological forces at play is adaptation. People adapt quickly to improvements. The nicer apartment that once felt exciting becomes normal within months. The upgraded car stops feeling special after a few weeks. The new routine becomes the baseline, but the cost of maintaining that baseline remains. This creates a one-way ratchet. Lifestyle moves up easily, but it rarely moves back down without discomfort. And because humans are loss-averse, the pain of giving something up feels stronger than the pleasure of gaining it in the first place. So even when finances feel tight, people cling to their current standard of living not because it's extravagant but because it's familiar. There's also identity involved. For many people, especially professionals and early career earners, lifestyle choices are tightly linked to self-worth. Where you live, what you drive, how you spend your weekends, these become signals both to others and to yourself that you're progressing. Choosing not to upgrade when income rises can feel like stagnation, even if it's strategically sound. The internal narrative becomes, if I'm doing better, my life should look better. The gap doesn't satisfy that narrative because it doesn't look like anything at all. Another psychological factor is the way debt reframes affordability. Monthly payments distort perception. A $30,000 car doesn't feel like $30,000, it feels like $450 a month. A $2,500 vacation doesn't feel like $2,500, it feels like points, or a few months of credit card payments. This fragmentation makes large financial decisions feel smaller and more manageable than they really are. The gap erodes not through one big choice but through a series of monthly obligations that collectively reduce flexibility. And once those obligations exist, they demand priority. You don't negotiate with fixed payments, you arrange your life around them. Over the long term, this has consequences that are easy to underestimate. A consistently narrow gap means savings grow slowly or inconsistently. Investing feels optional rather than automatic. Compounding, which depends on time and consistency, never fully engages. The difference between saving $300 a month and $1,200 a month doesn't feel dramatic in a single year. Over 20 or 30 years, it's the difference between financial independence and permanent dependence on income. But because the impact is delayed, the trade-off doesn't feel urgent when the decision is made. There's also a subtle emotional cost. When the gap is small, financial decisions carry emotional weight. People hesitate to take risks, not reckless ones, but reasonable ones. Changing jobs feels dangerous. Starting a business feels impossible. Taking time off feels irresponsible. Even small disruptions cause stress because there's no buffer to absorb them. Life becomes reactive. You're constantly managing what already exists rather than creating what could exist. This state isn't dramatic enough to force change, but it's draining enough to limit growth. What's interesting is that many people interpret this stress as a personal failure rather than a structural one. They assume they need better budgeting, more discipline, or higher income. Rarely do they consider that the core issue is the relationship between income growth and expense growth. They chase optimization instead of rethinking the framework. But optimization can't fix a system that's designed to consume surplus as soon as it appears. Contrast this with how financially intelligent people approach the same situation. Not wealthier people necessarily, just people who think differently. They don't view raises or bonuses as signals to upgrade life immediately. They see them as rare opportunities to permanently widen the gap. The lifestyle may improve eventually, but only after the surplus is secured. Comfort is delayed, not denied. And because the delay is intentional, it doesn't feel like deprivation. It feels like strategy. These people also separate identity from consumption more consciously. Their sense of progress comes from increased optionality, not visible upgrades. A growing gap means more choices, less stress, and more resilience. That's the reward they optimize for. They understand that the real luxury isn't nicer things, it's the ability to say no. No to bad jobs, no to financial anxiety, no to decisions made under pressure. Over decades, this difference compounds quietly. Two people can earn similar incomes and live in similar cities yet end up in completely different financial positions. One continually trades surplus for comfort, the other protects the gap first and lets comfort follow slowly. Neither path looks dramatic in the short term, but over time, one leads to dependence on income and the other leads to independence from it. The tragedy is that this isn't taught explicitly. Most people learn by imitation, and most people around them are following the default path. So the gap remains invisible, misunderstood, and undervalued. It's treated as leftover money rather than the core driver of long-term stability. Recognizing this doesn't require guilt or drastic change, it requires awareness. Once you see how the gap works, how it's eroded, why it's protected by some and ignored by others, you start to understand that financial intelligence isn't about extreme frugality or secret knowledge. It's about noticing where your future is being quietly traded for your present and deciding whether that trade is actually worth it. That shift in awareness sets the stage for a different way of thinking about money, one that isn't driven by fear or ambition, but by clarity. Once people become aware of the gap, something subtle but important changes in how they interpret everyday financial decisions. Expenses stop being judged only by whether they're affordable and start being evaluated by what they do to flexibility. Financially intelligent people don't ask, "Can I pay for this?" They ask, "What does this commit me to?" That shift sounds small, but it completely changes behavior. A monthly payment isn't just a number, it's a reduction in future options. And when you start seeing commitments this way, many reasonable upgrades begin to look heavier than they first appear. This doesn't mean these people live austerely or reject comfort. Their lives often look fairly normal from the outside. The difference is timing and intention. They delay locking in higher fixed costs even when income allows it. They understand that fixed expenses are gravity. Once increased, they pull everything else down. Variable expenses can be adjusted. Fixed ones demand obedience. So the goal becomes keeping fixed costs boring and predictable for as long as possible, even as income rises. Not forever, just long enough for the gap to grow into something meaningful. This perspective also changes how raises and bonuses are emotionally processed. Instead of feeling like permission to upgrade immediately, extra income feels like leverage. It's a rare chance to change the slope of the financial curve. Financially intelligent people often live through several income increases before making any visible lifestyle changes at all, not because they enjoy deprivation but because they understand momentum. A widening gap creates calm. Calm creates better decisions. Better decisions create compounding effects that no single purchase can match. They also think in terms of optionality rather than optimization. Rather than trying to squeeze maximum enjoyment out of every dollar today, they focus on expanding the range of choices they'll have tomorrow. This makes their decisions appear conservative in the short term but surprisingly generous in the long term. When opportunities arise, a career move, a relocation, a downturn, an investment, they're able to act without panic because the gap gives them room to absorb uncertainty. Another key difference is how they interpret social pressure. They're aware of it, but they don't treat it as guidance. When peers upgrade lifestyles, they don't feel compelled to match it immediately. They recognize that most visible consumption is financed by future income, not surplus. That realization makes comparison less tempting. The question stops being, can I keep up, and becomes, what are they trading away that I can't see? Often the answer is the gap. This way of thinking reframes patience. Waiting is no longer passive, it's active protection. Choosing not to upgrade isn't a failure to enjoy life, it's a decision to preserve freedom. And because that decision is internal, it doesn't require validation. The reward shows up quietly: lower stress, faster recovery from setbacks, and a sense that money is a tool rather than a constant concern. Over time, this approach creates asymmetry. Small, consistent gaps accumulate into significant reserves. Investments are made without urgency. Mistakes are survivable. Income becomes less fragile. Eventually, the relationship flips. Expenses become something income supports, not something income races to keep up with. That's the point where money stops feeling tight, even if income itself isn't extraordinary. Importantly, financially intelligent people don't romanticize this process. They don't believe it guarantees happiness or eliminates uncertainty. They simply recognize that a larger gap reduces unnecessary stress. It doesn't solve every problem, but it makes most problems easier to handle. And in a world full of noise and pressure, that quiet advantage matters more than flashy gains. This shift in perspective isn't about becoming a different person, it's about seeing the same decisions through a different lens, the lens of commitments, optionality, and time. Once that lens is in place, the gap stops being accidental, it becomes intentional. And when the gap is intentional, it stops shrinking quietly in the background and starts working for you instead. When you step back and look at the full picture, the gap strategy isn't really a strategy in the traditional sense. There are no tricks, no hacks, no clever maneuvers to outsmart the system. It's simply a way of seeing money more clearly. It starts with the realization that financial progress doesn't come from how much you earn, but from how much space you preserve between income and obligations. That space is quiet, it doesn't announce itself. But over time, it shapes almost every meaningful financial outcome. For most people, the goal was never to become wealthy in an abstract sense. It was to feel less tense about money, to feel like one unexpected expense wouldn't derail everything, to feel like choices were available instead of forced. The gap directly serves those goals. A wider gap absorbs shocks. It turns surprises into inconveniences instead of crises. It allows decisions to be made with thought instead of urgency. And importantly, it does this without requiring extreme behavior. No one needs to reject modern life to benefit from it. They just need to stop letting every improvement in income immediately harden into permanent expense. What makes this approach sustainable is that it's grounded in reality, not discipline alone. It acknowledges that people want comfort, convenience, and enjoyment. It doesn't shame those desires, it simply reframes their timing. Comfort purchased too early often costs freedom later. Comfort purchased slowly after the gap is protected tends to feel lighter and less risky. The same lifestyle acquired at a different time has a completely different psychological weight. If there's one idea worth carrying forward, it's this: income growth is rare and valuable. Lifestyle upgrades are always available. You can upgrade almost anything at almost any time. But you can only widen the gap when income changes or when you consciously choose to create space. Treating those moments with intention is what separates stagnation from quiet progress, not overnight success, just steady movement in a direction that actually changes how life feels. None of this requires guilt. If your gap is small, that doesn't mean you failed. It means you followed the default path in a system designed to make that path easy. Awareness isn't an accusation, it's an invitation to see things differently going forward. Even small shifts in how the gap is protected can have outsized effects over long periods of time. The math is simple. The patience is the hard part. In the end, the gap isn't about deprivation. It's about ownership of time, of choices, of future versions of yourself. And once you start seeing it that way, money becomes less emotional and more functional, not exciting, just useful, which for most people is exactly what they wanted all along. If this way of thinking helped you see your finances more clearly, you can support the channel by subscribing or liking the video. That's all.